Can I trust you with something?
Always, you know that.
I've been having dreams about Arrakis and the Fremen.
Dreams make good stories. But everything important happens when we're awake.
And on this episode of Zach Parsons Projects, I got to talk with my Twitter and online friend, Zac Little. Zach's got a podcast called The Last Podcast with Zac Little. Just kidding, he changed the name, I forgot. It's called Make a Mixtape with Zac Little. But I first discovered him through his The Last Podcast and really fell in love with his approach to editing and mixing in music with commentary and conversation. It takes me a little while in this to get to that introduction, so I'm doing it more properly now. I hope you enjoy the conversation. We have always bonded over films, and then when some of the more like epic Messianic characters have shown up and we have gravitated towards those characters, we thought it'd be fun to try and list our top 5 each. And he kind of helped me come up with this title of the most Messianic Messiahs. So I give my 5, he gives his 5. We give each other 5 minutes each to go through them. And it's a pretty interesting and hopefully entertaining conversation. Honestly, this is it as far as what I have in the can. So where we go next could be up to you. Leave me a comment, make a suggestion. What else should I project on?
All right. Okay. So we've had some fun conversations that have showed up, I think, almost exclusively at this point, almost exclusively on your channel, on your podcast. And this one may be more of that as well. So I'll leave that part up to you. As maybe I'll jump into like a little bit of like an intro for people who don't know who you are.
You're hosting this one.
I'm hosting this.
You do it. This is you now.
You sit back and relax.
This is Zac Parsons project.
Look good. That's right.
Is it an Alan Parsons project pun, by the way?
Absolutely.
Okay, just making sure.
So you're probably the youngest person who lives who would understand that, but because you're so into music, it's not that surprising.
I blame The Simpsons, honestly, for having like this deep well of like Gen X knowledge. Yeah. Because I had to understand what those references were all about, right?
You got to go look them up.
Yeah. That's why.
Awesome. Well, like The Simpsons is your Ulysses, or what's that book that people would always talk about that was like so difficult to understand? It would take years and years and years for people to unpack it. It helps if I knew what the reference was, because then that would make this more of a quip.
Infinite Jest? I feel like Infinite Jest, the knock on that is that it's literally just physically hard to read. Like, yes. I don't ever try to
like hold it. Your muscles get sore from holding it.
It has end notes, which is much harder than footnotes. So you have this giant book that you just keep flopping back to the end notes, and you're reading the end notes for like sometimes 20, 30 minutes of end notes before you go back to where you were in the book. So that's why Infinite Jest is so hard to read. It's not that it's hard to read; it's that it's physically hard to read. Sure.
Now, be honest. Did you finish it?
Infinite Jest? No.
Me neither.
No, I remember probably about 10 years ago was when I tried to read Infinite Jest. And I remember sitting in the break room of my old job and being like really mired in a list of fictional movies in the end notes. And just being like, I'm out.
So I thought you were going to say that's where you like really leaned in. Like, I would watch the crap out of that movie.
No, because I don't think David Foster Wallace has a very high opinion of like TV and movies. He was very much he spoke to their addictive powers, but I don't think he thought very well of them. So his list of movies is like a description of someone who hates movies, describing movies. You know, like let me give you a list of all the terrible ideas, because that's all movies are, terrible ideas. You know, and so that's what I wasn't wild about it. If they were a bunch of great ideas, yeah, I'd be in. Like reading David Foster Wallace's Letterboxd, I'd be in.
You should start that. I mean, so like I keep alluding to trying to introduce you, and now I'm going to try.
We'll get there eventually.
This will make more sense to people, I hope, and I hope that they will sort of jump in. A lot of ways that I like to encourage people to discover you is to go into your podcast feed and just sort of find a title that find a series of words that jumps out to you and say, that's the one that you need to try, and just stick with it the whole time. Because it's really, I mean this as a compliment. I have no idea where you're going to go from beat to beat. And it's like such an adventure of, okay, Zac is going to have a conversation with somebody, probably. It might just be one person. He's going to intersperse his own commentary about that conversation and about what he's been doing recently and what both experiences have been reminding him of. And then music will come in and out of the entire podcast experience. And there might be a theme associated with it, or it may just be up to you to decide what that theme is if you're unfamiliar with most of the music, which is usually my experience.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair description of what the podcast is like. It's, it's a very heavily edited podcast, and I have to kind of keep myself entertained as I go. And so sometimes what you're hearing, it's not that I think that the audience is going to get bored. It's that I'm getting bored. I've been editing the same 5 minutes of conversation for a long time, and I got to do something to wake me up. Every episode of the podcast that comes out, I've heard the whole thing like 60 times, and so that can be, that's weird. It's pretty weird, but I've also found it to be a real tool to help me understand, right? I don't think I was a very good listener early on in my life, and even kind of early on in my podcast career, but you end up being forced to listen. And over time, those habits, they get more instilled in you, and you become a better listener. You don't have to play the conversation back 60 times anymore because
oh, that's what they were saying.
Because you become a better listener and you understand more of what's being said in the moment. So there are times when there's very little of the kind of like the sort of God voice in the podcast.
Right.
And that's because I feel like I was locked in the whole time,
Yeah, right.
So
in the original recording.
Yeah. If there's something I want to take back, or say better, then I will kind of take over. I'll take over the show from my past self. Yeah.
Do you ever find yourself now, because how many episodes have you, you've done a few different iterations of it. How many podcast episodes would you say you've done at this point?
Like 130, something like that.
Are you at the point now to where, because of that multiple stage of like, there's recording and then there's editing, where you are sort of already in editing brain in the middle of a conversation, or you're like, oh, I know exactly what I'm going to put right there?
I try not to be.
Yeah.
It kicks on toward the end of conversations.
Yeah. And there's hopefully naturally, finding a landing point or a conclusion.
Yeah. But otherwise, that's one way that you don't listen very well, right? Is if you're thinking about how you're going to edit it later. So I actually try to just really trust myself in the future. Yeah. I try to trust future Zac to handle it. And I just try to be in it and hope I got what I wanted to get,
I think that's wise. Yeah. Because you really kind of can trust yourself. If you do trust yourself to be able to find something or often many things that you could sort of branch off from in a conversation to make it more compelling or interesting, then you can be sort of all in.
But I did interview a chef yesterday who was a James Beard nominated chef who's been on Beat Bobby Flay, and I love Beat Bobby Flay. And I asked vanishingly few questions about Beat Bobby Flay because I was like in the moment, following the flow of conversation. And if I could take it back, I would have asked a lot more about Beat Bobby Flay.
Well, now you can just project your own sort of Beat Bobby Flay, sprinkles into it at the end of it, which you did ask if the Zac Parsons project was an Alan Parsons project thing. But the other sort of little twist is that it's actually Canadian. It's Zac Parsons Projects.
Oh, right. Of course. Yes. I have heard the way that you've pronounced that in previous episodes. And I did remember that, but it slipped away. But yes.
Yeah. Well, it's just a fun little thing to sort of remind me that, and maybe even argue to others that that's all we're ever really doing, is sort of projecting our meaning into things. And therefore, we're never getting back something that's purely objective. It's still sort of being filtered through our biases and preferences and pains and all of that kind of stuff, which I'm going to go ahead and try and make another move because we have an agenda today.
We do.
We could probably just turn on the microphones and just have at least a conversation that's entertaining for two people,
Right?
Without much context.
I know.
We were kind of going back and forth in a fun way on Twitter, and I think it actually started around the Dune 2 release, right? Because everyone was like, "Oh, Dune 2 is amazing," and what comes after Dune 2? Dune Messiah. And it would be interesting if we could come up with a list of, I don't remember what we said. We say best or most compelling or most interesting or favorite. What did we end up landing on as like the modifier?
Most messianic messiahs.
The most messianic messiahs. And we may have our title right there. I think I may have initially pitched you on doing it around movies. But I know that you also have a love for TV and film and just sort of, music. So we've opened up the genre categories. You know, they can be wherever.
I was really looking for like a Messiah in song. But I don't really think that I've found one.
Well, Jay-Z immediately comes to mind. And I honestly think I know more about Jay-Z through listening to your podcast than any other source. Like I am just old enough or uncool enough to have missed. Wait, I just said Jay-Z, and that's how uncool I am because what I meant was Kanye.
Sure.
Kanye, Yeezy. That's where I got confused.
I suppose you're right. I would say that there is a Messiah narrative that is kind of threaded throughout Kanye West's discography, but I would say the ultimate arc and resolution of that storyline is yet to come to pass, right? We don't know what's going to happen with Kanye. I still believe that he can kind of pull out of the sort of tailspin that he has been in for the last couple of years. I think I want to believe that Kanye is talented enough to be able to kind of make up for anything. I want to live in a world where that can be true. So yeah, I do have faith that Kanye will return, as messiahs tend to do. And we will look at this part of Kanye's life as, the 3 days he was dead.
Okay.
We'll see.
I love it. I mean, and like I said, you would know, like I look to you as sort of one of my Kanye resources, which I haven't been on Jeopardy and got that question yet, but I'm ready to call you with a lifeline as I mix metaphors and mix game show things.
Have you ever taken the Jeopardy test to like apply to be a guest on Jeopardy?
Oh no, I'd be terrible at it. I assume I'd be. Have you?
No, I did interview a guy. I've got a friend of the show who was on Jeopardy as a teenager. Yeah.
Okay. So now I got like so many things going off. My editing brain is starting to kick in a little bit, but also just my connection brain is kicking because you just like referenced a scene kind of in two ways from one of my messiahs.
All right, let's get into it.
Should I just start with that one?
Sure. Tell me about it.
Okay. So what we're going to try and do, I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes and we will try, when this timer goes off, every 5 minutes, try to gracefully.
New Messiah. Every 5 minutes, new Messiah.
New Messiah every 5 minutes. So my first Messiah, and I wonder if, because you said you had 5.5. So maybe you've got like your half in your back pocket in case you double dip.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sure we will double dip. So
I think you will. Okay, so first Messiah, Kevin from The Leftovers.
I had this too.
Okay. And did you actually rank yours? Because I know you and your brother do a fun thing where you really try and say, now this was the number 3 best, Wilco album of the 2010s or something like that.
I thought about it, but I think that in the case of different messiahs, they're all over the map in terms of like their form and purpose. So it's really difficult to quantify. So we'll just call Kevin, number 1 on the list so far.
And so Kevin Garvey is the name of the character from The Leftovers. And so since this is a double dip, when we get to 5 minutes, how about that's when you sort of maybe really take over and fill in details that I maybe didn't bring over. So 10 minutes on Kevin Garvey to start us out. So the book that the first season of The Leftovers was based on was it Tom Perrotta?
Yeah.
Am I pronouncing that right or remembering that right?
Yes.
So he put out this great book. Everyone loved it. A rapture type event happened, and the world sort of has to deal with the aftermath with not a lot of answers being given, and sort of the meaning-making tendencies of the different people in this, I believe, fictional town in upstate New York. Is that right? Am I getting my details so far from what you remember?
So far, you're on.
Okay. And Kevin is basically the main character. I can't remember if he's like a narrator or if it's more third person in the book, but in the show, the HBO show, which was the showrunner was Damon Lindelof, who I think we both have a lot of affinity for. Yes. So, and the actor who plays Kevin is on the tip of my tongue. He's a beautiful man.
Justin Theroux,
also the writer of Tropic Thunder
and Iron Man 2.
Yes, a great skilled, creator in a lot of his own rights. But he really embodies this character well in the first season, and it's largely faithful to the book. And a lot of interesting things happen. There's a cult that exists that sort of takes a more nihilistic turn in their meaning making. There's a pastor who is like, well, why wasn't I, taken up? This is sort of what I've been preparing for. God would have taken me, surely. And Kevin's breakdown has more to do with like his family and where he fits. And there's a lot of other reasons that make it interesting for me as a father and as a family man. Him and his wife end up getting divorced. I think we've talked about that before. That's been a really meaningful part of sort of my life and meaning making. But then where it really gets deep for me is in seasons 2 and 3. And so Damon Lindelof and the creators have this world that has taken us through the conclusion of the book. And then kind of all bets are off. Where do you want to go from here? And where Kevin goes specifically geographically is Texas to Jarden, Texas, which took me way too long to realize the metaphor of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Jarden of,
Yeah.
But he goes this place, and the reason that Jarden is interesting in the story is because of all the people who were raptured in the world, about 2% of the population. Not a single person from this walled garden, this Garden of Eden, was taken. And so it is believed that there has been a special divine sort of protection in this place. So he ends up going there, and to speed up into the sort of Messiah aspects of it, there's a moment when he has to face death, and he tries to sort of meet his death at his own hands and is miraculously saved. We're going to get into spoilers here, right? I'm already kind of spoiling something. So
vaguely, but I think you're, yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think Leftovers is kind of a spoiler-proof show. Like, even if you kind of have a sense of where it's going, the manner and the mood by which it gets there is always so unexpected. And I think that's kind of the secret thing about it. It's so great.
And exactly, because you don't, I mean, it does sort of pitch itself as a religious show from the beginning, but then how it deals with it, I mean, it doesn't feel like a Christian, show at all. Like, there's, sex and violence and despair all over the place. And even at the end of season 1 with like the cult leader, Hattie, and the way that she ends up, I want to talk about it without spoiling things, but I'm just going to say, guys, this might be a spoiler. She ends up killing herself. 5 minutes. Zach, take it from here.
Well, okay, so I would say that when I think about the kind of Messiah narrative of The Leftovers, I think mostly about like season 3 and Kevin's father becoming sort of like
Kevin Sr.
His sort of primary evangelist, basically, his primary believer in the world. And there's something about that as a not particularly religious person, the relationship between father and son in that, as it's sort of illustrated mostly in that last season, always really struck me. I always think about his father wandering the desert, playing a cassette tape of his infant son's voice, as a person who records the voices of my young children all the time.
It's Zac Little. I love it.
Yeah, and so that image really sticks with me. But his father kind of believing in him, I think that The Leftovers really embraces ambiguity right up until the end. It's very intentionally ambiguous. It's rather, I guess, like the reality of the world is ambiguous, but the emotions are not. Right. So that's right. Because that's what's important.
Yeah.
So that has always been kind of the standout few moments of the seasons moments between Kevin Sr. and the kind of, whether it's unclear because his father has struggled with mental illness, so it's not clear whether what his father believes is really what's happening or not. And it never becomes clear, right? The show never says, yep, he was right.
Yeah. He didn't have a break with reality, or he had a break into an actual reality or something like that. That's never clear. It's up for us to decide if that's actually what's happening.
And I love that that is true. And I love that so we can kind of vaguely transition into Dune 2 without setting a timer on ourselves here.
Sure.
But I think that I rewatched both Dune movies. So Dune 1 is mostly about fate versus free will. Right. So there's you've got the character of Duke Leto, who is like pure fate guy. Right. He basically just like lets this horrible thing happen to him and his family because he sees no way out of it. He only starts to take action against the Harkonnens, like right at the very end, right? The last possible moment does he finally break from being like Mr. Pure Fate guy, for lack of a better name. And
pure fate guy.
And then the rest of the movie, like Dune 1 has the weirdest like final moment you could imagine, in that like it hinges on remembering that the guy in Paul's visions is this guy that he's seeing now and has to fight. Like you just see these flickering visions throughout the movie, and then you're supposed to like remember that guy's face. And like I'm not great at remembering faces, so I'm like, I think that's the same guy. but knowing that is crucial to understanding that Paul's visions aren't coming true, right? Like he has these visions and they're only like 40% accurate, right? So it's like a very direct calling into question fate versus free will. He had this vision of the future,
a directionality or a seeming. It's just it's not that clarity. It's not a black and white.
Yeah, he's not seeing the future.
Yeah.
He's seeing something in the future that could come to pass and doesn't. And so that's interesting. And then the second movie, I feel like, is a little more direct in what it's about, and it's about the prophecy versus propaganda kind of question, right? And it really illustrates that what these people believe is Bene Gesserit propaganda. And yet it also is saying, maybe it's true, right? Like maybe the hand is not the hand that maybe the Bene Gesserit aren't guiding these people to believe in this thing. Maybe the hand is guiding the Bene Gesserit to guide these people to believe in this thing. There's no hand on the hand. Yeah. And so
instead of turtles all the way down, it's hands all the way up.
Yeah. And I found that to be like very interesting, but not not emotionally engaging. And so I was thinking about the fact that The Leftovers is another story about prophecy versus propaganda, particularly in the third season with the literal book of Kevin that his followers kind of make. And when he sees it, he's like, what the hell is this? You guys have written a holy book about my life. I'm just like a cop in Texas. And so that, but he eventually starts to believe his own propaganda a little bit, right? Like Kevin sort of starts to believe in the myth of Kevin. To both disastrous and wondrous results. So the same kind of thing's happening with Paul Atreides, right? He's starting to believe in the prophecy, but is it actually a prophecy, or is it propaganda, or is it both?
All right, so we're still keeping on the 5-minute time frame, but we're into overtime of the Kevin Paul overlap. So
we're drifting into Dune now. So we should talk about Dune and Paul Atreides being like an anti-messiah. That Dennis Herbert. Wait, am I getting the name right? The author of Dune? It's Herbert. Frank.
I think so. Yep.
I think I know a Dennis Herbert.
It's Denis Villeneuve. I can't. Pronouncing his name.
Yeah. Denis Villeneuve. Yep. And then, so
maybe we got the Dennis part mixed up. I think it was Frank Herbert.
Frank Herbert, very famously, did not like the fact that people finished Dune and were like, hell yeah, Paul Atreides, we must harness desert power. So he wrote Dune Messiah as a corrective, but Denis Villeneuve was like, I think I'm going to start to build this correction into my story in Dune 2, and I will use, Zendaya's character to do that, which I don't know if you rewatched Dune 1, but definitely didn't know he was going to do that in Dune 1.
She's barely in Dune 1.
And toward the end, she says something like, oh, the journey's just beginning or something. And it's like, I love Zendaya. I think she's a great actor. It's like, she did not have that character down at that point, right? She'd been on that set for probably like a day. She did the Anya Taylor-Joy thing where like she was there for an hour.
Did you get it? Okay.
She didn't know yet. She wasn't in it. She didn't know what it was going to be. So it's exciting to she sort of takes over the second movie, and she really has a sense of it then. And I do like that. I like watching people figure it out. That's one thing I like about TV. I like a TV show that starts out kind of a mess, and then, then they get it together. Yeah. I can't think of a good example. I can only think of Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip, which did the opposite. Started out really strong and just absolutely collapsed on itself. Yeah. It's too bad. That was a tough year as a big Aaron Sorkin, Matthew Perry guy, watching that happen.
Yeah, I missed all. I was aware of it, but didn't get into it to be able to sort of weigh in.
You don't have to. Don't worry about it.
Now, have you read all or any of the Dune books? Like,
no.
Is this whole okay?
Never read it.
So
none.
Okay, but you have some awareness of this sort of corrective in the forthcoming Messiah.
Yeah, mostly from listening to like interviews with Denis Villeneuve. That's where that's where I heard that from.
Do you follow Tom van der Linden at all?
No.
On Twitter. What? Yes, you do. You probably just don't know that you follow him. I'm sure you do. So his YouTube name is LikeStoriesofOld. Is that still not ringing any bells?
No.
Dude, you just need to cancel your plans for the rest of the week. It will blow your mind. He is my number one YouTube.
Tom van der Linden.
Tom van der Linden. His YouTube channel is called Like Stories of Old. My editing brain is on. I'll edit a bunch of stuff into this when I publish it. But he is, in my opinion, the top video essayist in terms of film that exists. Like I've set in the bar super high. Your expectations will be through the roof. Okay. And he will still exceed them.
I'm ready.
So he talked about this sort of turn in Messiah as well. And I didn't know if you had already had that. But I find myself saying, don't tell me anymore. Like, I don't want the spoilers. Like, I remember when I was watching another movie in IMAX before Dune 2 had come out, and the Dune 2 trailer comes up, and I'm plugging my ears, but then like this, it's so loud.
It's too loud. There's no way.
I have to like sort of alternate how I'm plugging and unplugging my ears. My eyes are closed. My kids, they always make fun of me for doing this, but it's like, I don't want anything spoiled. And I remember opening up my eyes after about 90 seconds or so and thinking like, that's probably at the end, right? And I just see like Josh Brolin like doing something. And I'm like, great, that tuck that in the back of my brain somewhere, whether I want to or not. And then watching the film, it's like an hour and a half before his character even like comes back in. And so I'm just like waiting. I'm like, okay, he's going to have his return. He's going to have his return. And then once that happened, I was able to settle into the experience of the film a little bit more. But I'll admit that I've only seen Dune 2 once so far. And so the way that it ended in those turns that those characters did take towards the legitimacy of his, not legitimacy, I don't know what word I'm looking for, reality of his messiahness, I feel like I will actually have a different experience watching it the second time with that knowledge as I go through the beats of it the first time.
Yeah.
Because rewatching, so like saw Dune 1, saw Dune 2, rewatched Dune 1. Dune 1 was so much better after Dune 2. And we're into our last 5 minutes of
I agree. I agree that Dune 1 was I had more fun watching it the second time after having gone through Dune 2. I think that the thing about Dune 2 is that it holds that idea that I've talked about. Is this prophecy? Is this propaganda? Is this fate? Is this free will? that second movie holds that question up so firmly in the middle of your brain as a viewer all the time. I don't think I've ever seen a movie so dedicated to keeping an idea afloat like that. It's very interesting, especially not like a movie with that kind of grand scale action too. There's like lots of little indie movies that kind of do that kind of thing, but they're like 80 minutes long because that's all they're trying to accomplish. Right. So I thought that was interesting, but I do think it came at a certain amount of expense, like watching there's a final battle at the end.
Oh yeah, with Austin Butler.
Yeah. And I was kind of watching it. I was watching it going like, this is really cool, but I don't care what happens. Right. And I was thinking about, I'd recently seen for the first time, I'd never seen Creed before. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So Creed, great movie. And I was watching Creed on a laptop in bed while my wife was sleeping next to me. Right. And during these fight scenes, I was like moving with him, like I was so in the ring with Creed. Wow. And I was like, I just, every time he got hit, you feel it and you feel horrible. And you're like, my guy needs to get through this, And I was so emotionally invested. There's two kind of huge set piece fight scenes in the first Creed movie. And I was so invested in it. I couldn't believe it. I was like, how do they do that? How do they do that? How do they make me feel like that? And
like you said, you're on a laptop. You're not in an IMAX, with the surround sound. Like you're in that. I mean, if you were on an iPhone, that would be like the worst possible thing that directors always say, I didn't shoot this film so some idiot could watch it on his iPhone today. Like,
although they're not thinking about it, the phone is like 3 inches from my face in the dark. So it's basically like being in a movie theater. It's destroying my vision. But yeah, no. And so when I watched Dune, that's what I was thinking about, is I was like, yes, we have achieved this very specific thematic point very, very well. But like, at what cost? What did we lose in terms of like emotional investment in the characters? When Paul makes some moves and some turns at the end, it's shocking, but it's mostly shocking because like Zendaya's face lands it for him. But like script wise, story wise, whatever, it's like, it's not really there,
Yeah. I felt the same way. He has another sort of like resurrection scene, I don't know, about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the second film, that I remember thinking, that didn't land for me like I would have expected it, because of how those sort of scenes in Kevin's, or not Kevin's portrayal, but like the portrayal of Kevin's resurrection.
Yeah.
Those hit me so hard. And there's multiple ones, right? And he has this whole process that he goes through where he can kind of go to this other world, this underworld, and come back. And in that third season, towards the end, when he sort of has to face the alter ego that he had sort of created for himself and sort of in real life was kind of going back and forth between the assassin and, the sheriff, the president, the father, the king, or whatever. And that sort of face off that they have, where one part of him lays down his life for him to cut it out. Like that whole sacrificial scene where he sacrifices to himself. I mean, it's shot incredibly. It's acted incredibly. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to get from it. But again, that's part of what Damon Lindelof does so well. It's like, he's not going to give you this paint by numbers, here's how you're supposed to feel. But I felt things in that scene that you could have ended the show with that and just said, hey, it's done. Story over. But then they take it like one more episode where it closes the loop on his real life relationship with another real human being. And then it's the Book of Nora and the way that he has to decide, does he believe her or not at the very end there?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's the only time in the story where there's not a flashback. Like where someone's telling a story and doesn't immediately cut to some sort of, portrayal of what's being described.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe it was, I think Tom Perrotta talked Damon Lindelof out of showing any of it.
Really?
Yeah. That they were actually maybe planning on, I mean, it would probably still have been ambiguous, right? Because you're not sure if what you're seeing is real or if it's kind of the images that Nora is conjuring as she tells the story.
Yep.
But I know that the idea was at least floated by someone to show some of it, and they ultimately decided against it. Because TV is a visual medium, right? So you expect to see things. You don't just expect to just hear people talking.
No, you may know this part, or maybe you don't, but Justin Theroux was once asked years later what his take on it was, and he's like, well, of course she made it up, because if she didn't, then we would have shown the the flashbacks for it. And she was, I'm going to just say, crucified by people who said, you as the actor who portrayed that character are not allowed to break up that ambiguity, because there's some sort of sacred responsibility. Like maybe there's things like Mark Hamill is not allowed to do because he was Luke Skywalker.
I feel like, so now you opened up two different places we could transition to.
Okay.
But we'll go with the less obvious one. But I will say that, I think that sometimes I think that tolerating ambiguity in endings is almost like a genetic, it's like cilantro. It's like certain people just can't do it.
I love cilantro. I literally, after this call, I have a plate of food that will be bathed in cilantro that is going to be awaiting me.
I'm right there with you. But I recognize that
now we have a new title for this podcast: Cilantros and Saviors.
Yeah, perfect. I love it. So here's
where you want to go with that, please.
So this is kind of a long walk, but a famous ambiguous ending is Inception, right? But one of the messiahs that I thought of was Batman in the Christopher Nolan trilogy. Right?
Oh, now I'm sad that I didn't think of it. I'm going to restart our 5 minutes, and I'm thrilled because I'm already with you. Of course.
Well, it's so funny because someone like Zack Snyder, right, who was pretty heavily involved in DC at the same time, Zack Snyder traffics in a lot of messianic imagery all the time. There's always a character who gets carried away from an injury and they're stretched out like they're on a cross. That's a Zack Snyder thing. We love the guy. That's how he cooks.
Yeah.
He uses a lot of cilantro. Christopher Nolan, you wouldn't really think of as that type of guy, right? But The Dark Knight Rises is such a messianic story. And of course, in trademark Christopher Nolan way, right? The Dark Knight is Christopher Nolan saying, what if Batman was real in the real world, specifically the movie Heat? What if Batman was in that movie? What would happen? But The Dark Knight Rises, a movie that I don't really like that much, for mostly superficial reasons. I can't get over the ADR sound of Bane, his voice. It just doesn't.
What you had to redo, right?
Exactly.
That was not. It tested poorly,
and it sounds like it. It sounds like in certain seasons of Arrested Development when they were re-editing it like crazy, and they had to just constantly dub in people's voices. So almost never is anyone's lips matching up with their mouth when they're talking because it's just they were rewriting it in editing. The same thing is true about Bane. It just doesn't sound like he's in the room ever, and it just keeps me forever being
takes you out of the moment,
immersed in that movie, but. At the same time, there is Nolan is kind of doing what's the most realistic version of a Messiah story I can tell. And I do think he sort of misses the mark a little bit because it's what Batman flies a nuclear bomb into the ocean with a plane. I think there might have been easier ways. But he,
can I jump into that part just very specifically? So did you watch 24, the TV show 24, the old
maybe the first 2 seasons of it? Yeah.
Okay, good, because it was in the second season that the most impactful moment for me happened when they had that bad guy. His name was Mason. He was always kind of he was Jack's boss or second boss, something like that. And they were always going back and forth and you kind of hate him. You love to hate him. And then that's the guy that they get to fly the nuclear bomb over the California desert and has this, I'm getting chills remembering it. He has this moment where it's okay, do we hate him because he's against Jack? Yes. But does he actually love his country and is willing to make the ultimate sacrifice? Watch.
Yeah, I love that.
And I'm just what you need in this is then a statue to that. What pissed me off in the subsequent seasons was this ultimate sacrifice was not appropriately recognized by the society that he just saved. He should be referenced multiple times in subsequent seasons of, do you remember what Mason did? Let's go to, Mason Day at the park, which is something that Nolan did so well with The Dark Knight and the Dark Knight trilogy. Okay. That's over.
That's true. Batman got that statue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Really, when I saw the statue, I saw it he's got the cowl and his head straight. It's like, this is what they should have done with this. This is an appropriate way for a society to recognize a savior.
Mm-hmm. And I do think after the major villains die in The Dark Knight Rises, the rest of the movie is great. And there's a lot of bright patches in there too. But the roughest it gets is when Bane and Talia al Ghul both fight it, especially because I can't remember the actress's name who plays Talia. She has the most cartoonish character death. If you go back and watch, she's in a van that crashes and she literally goes
she's so they're breathing, struggling to breathe, and then gives her last little line. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a worse one in Fantastic Four, the Josh Trank, very bad, Michael B. Jordan. Don't ever see it. It's horrible.
Didn't even see it.
But a character who you're supposed to feel really sad about dying, gets killed by Dr. Doom, and he crosses his eyes like a cartoon character. So I'm
just two big X's just appear over her face.
They must have known the ship was going down on that movie, but in the case of The Dark Knight Rises, it's very cartoonish and silly. Anyway.
What about the very last scene? Did you appreciate the sort of thing with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, getting on the platform and literally a new Dark Knight rises?
Yeah, I thought that was cool.
Gary's last shot.
I even think the fact that his first name is Robin is cool. I'm fine with that. Sometimes people get upset that the superhero myths get messed around with a little bit. They're his name's not really Robin. It's well, relax, man. Adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been too on the nose. It's if you introduce him as Robin at the beginning of the movie, everybody knows the end of that story.
Yeah.
So if you're making an actual movie that has allusions to Jesus, and a guy in the first act says, "Hey, my name's Judas," you're gonna know how that plays out.
You gotta have some restraint. He's got to be just Jude.
Yes. Or a Sweet J, or something kind of funny like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, we got a timer. All right, so I'm gonna go with. Unless you said you had two places you could go, what was your second one? Yeah. I kind of feel like.
Well, you brought up Skywalker. You brought up knockoff Paul Atreides.
Okay, go for it. Give us the Luke Skywalker as savior breakdown.
I mean, I grew up loving Star Wars. I'm not precious about Star Wars like certain Star Wars fans are, and I haven't.
Which trilogy did you experience in? How was your experience?
The original one. I think my dad got me interested in Star Wars because my dad really loved Han Solo. My dad really wanted to be Han Solo, so I also really wanted to be Han Solo. And so I remember playing Star Wars in third grade. And I think that the trilogy was re-released into theaters around that time, but I'm not sure when it was. I might not have been old enough to go to a theater when that happened, but I definitely had the VHSs of the original trilogy. And then I saw the George Lucas re-edits. And then the prequel trilogy came out. And by then I was old enough to kind of I saw the first one and then I was that's not for me. And so I never saw 2 and 3 of the prequels.
Really? Still to this day?
No. And then when it came to the most recent versions of Star Wars, I saw episode 7 and I saw The Last Jedi and I was that's great. And then I saw what was happening with my guy, Rian Johnson, and I was I'm out. And so I never saw Skywalker Rises or whatever that was.
Rise of Skywalker.
Rise of Skywalker. Never saw that. And I've heard that was a good decision. And since then, the only Star Wars that I've consumed has been Andor, which again, great decision.
Oh.
Somehow I'm batting 1,000 on my Star Wars consumption, so I'm very careful.
No. I'll say actually, I don't know how to put this other than giving away some sort of spoiler. There's one other thing that if that's all the Star Wars you've consumed.
Well, we hashed this out about spoilers one time, and you're the guy who's very spoiler averse, and I'm kind of I can roll with it.
Okay. So I'm gonna go to the end of Skywalker. You're gonna maybe take us to the end of Skywalker and his sacrifice, perhaps. But in The Mandalorian, which is, in its own little sort of side universe, and the fact that it found an audience, was kind of impressive in light of like some of the other Star Wars things that haven't found an audience. But at the end of the second season, you've heard of Baby Yoda at this point, right? You can't avoid Baby Yoda.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, I know his name's Grogu.
Baby Yoda is Grogu.
Yeah.
And they like put this call out to like someone in the galaxy, help us, come help us. Like Grogu has been kidnapped. And then this like ship comes and docks, and this like cloaked guy comes out, and it's like all shot through security cam footage. And he's like going through, and he's like just like fucking up like stormtroopers and like all these robots, and he's just like going to town, and you can't really see what color his lightsaber is. And then you're like, oh wait, is that a green lightsaber? And you're like looking, you're like, wait, what's the timeline? And all of a sudden, you realize that it's Luke Skywalker, and I start bawling. I have not cried that hard in a movie. Not even a movie, TV show. I have not cried that hard in a TV show other than Lost, which maybe we'll get to next, than that scene.
Sure.
And it was like, what is this like archetypal thing where just the immediate recognition of Luke does that for me?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't feel as though I think my remaining emotional tether was to like Harrison Ford. So
okay, good.
So I got my moment
in episode 7.
Yes, I did. So and
did you cry? I mean, how?
No.
Give me a sense of how that. Okay, not that level of emotional devastation.
I think that I don't think J.J. Abrams has ever made me really feel. I think he engages a certain kind of brain, and I mean honestly, and also I will say I don't think really Rian Johnson has either. I think that Rian Johnson's movies are like really interesting and really well crafted puzzle boxes, and I would say that's true about even The Last Jedi. It's not that different from like a Knives Out movie in the way that it sort of seeks just primarily to surprise you. But I will say that does complicate the Messiah narrative of Luke Skywalker, right? Because you learn about this kind of late in life temptation to the dark side or to a dark side.
Oh yeah, people hated that. They hated Ryan's interpretation of that. And then like there's the whole burning of like the sacred books and like people were not ready for that sort of turn. And like I again, that's kind of like what we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation. Like, I love that I don't know where you're going to go next.
Very funny, like that. There's a very funny moment though when I forget, is it Luke who's upset that the books are burned, and Yoda's like, I've never read those, like.
Yeah, it's like.
Were you ever going to read those?
As you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We got to move to another one, and I'm going to build on your J.J. Abrams thing and go to Lost. So J.J. Abrams famously was the sort of like Kickstarter, but not the showrunner of Lost, along with eventually Carlton Cuse and Damon Lindelof.
Yes.
And it was also famously the most expensive TV pilot of all time. Originally cast in the role of Jack. Do you know this trivia?
Jim Caviezel?
That would be great. That'd be two on the nose. They are doing a sequel of The Passion, which I have feelings about. But no, it was actually a lot of people's favorite Batman, Michael Keaton.
Oh, really?
And he was written to die in the first episode.
Okay, I did know that. Yeah.
The Game of Thrones, Sean Bean. It's like, oh, well, Sean Bean just got killed in the first season. Oh, well, this show is not going to pull any punches.
Or like Drew Barrymore debating a Scream.
Okay, yeah, exactly. It's like, whoa, all bets are off. And then I either because they didn't get Michael Keaton and they got the guy from Party of Five, and they were like, well, you know what, we can afford, a full season or two with Matthew Fox. And who knows what the reasons were. But then he sort of becomes this flawed savior character. So now remind me, did you follow Lost or no?
Nope. Still haven't seen Lost. I got to get to it eventually.
So this will be the one to where I tread maybe the lightest.
Understood.
Because his arc has some pretty important points that it's important that you don't see them coming, I think. And the music as well, like Michael Giacchino, not sure if I'm pronouncing his name the right way. Like he does the score and the soundtrack, and it's masterful, right? Like he is Hans Zimmer-esque in his ability to capture the emotion of a scene with a score. And like I will sort of go back and re-listen to, like just before this call, I was re-listening to the last 4 minutes of the last episode of Lust, where there's an ending, an ambiguous ending, or maybe it wasn't ambiguous enough, talking about controversial endings and their ambiguity or telling you exactly what happened. People hated that ending.
Yeah, sure.
Do you remember this?
I do remember, yeah.
Yeah. But you just don't necessarily know what all the details of what the ending were and if you could agree with it or not. But what made Jack, his character, unique for me, it was kind of like what you said about Kevin or the Kevins, is that there's this tension and relationship with his father and the expectations that he does or doesn't fulfill as he steps into the same career as his father, as well as a son that he has, and him not trying to sort of perpetuate the same, the sins of the father, onto the son or something.
Yeah.
So that dynamic hit home for me a lot, as well as just, and not as well as, but that's always been something that the Jesus character in the Bibles was sort of lacking. So we don't have an example in the Bible of Jesus and his wife, or then therefore Jesus and his family. And so the elements of the Savior as a father aren't brought in there. And we're getting into dicey territory here, judging the sacrifices of Jesus. So hey, I got saved by the alarm. Maybe I'll hold off on that. All right, where should we go next?
All right. Well, I only have one full entry left here, which is Harry Potter.
Oh, now you get to judge me for because I haven't seen all of them.
Well, that's fine. I would say that I read all the Harry Potter books like in one summer, like the summer before the last one came out. I remember I moved to Boston, and that summer was the 7th book, and we went to like Harvard Square. There was like a big party. It was like I did a very accelerated course in Harry Potter. It was just that summer, and I read all the books. I've never revisited them since. But then
wow.
I
you have a
enjoyed
very specific experience and memory of that.
Yep.
That's kind of beautiful.
I read most of them on the roof of my apartment building in Philadelphia. And then the last book kind of, tore through it in an apartment in Boston. But I always was interested in the movies as kind of works of adaptation, and they sort of have to condense and clean up some of the themes and everything. And I always thought they did a really good job. I remember having conversations with people who were maybe longer term Harry Potter people who were really upset about certain decisions that they made. But I would say like, well, think about it. How are you going to tell this story in 2 hours? What are you going to do? This is the only really way you're going to be able to get from point A to point B to point C. And even then they had to take the 7th movie and split it in half, Yeah,
the 7th book was 2 movies, right?
Yeah, starting an unfortunate trend, I think, of splitting movies in half. I think we should work harder to like adapt and condense things down. I think that's a cool thing about Dune is that, it really sounds like there's just going to be 3. So technically, yes, Dune
sounds
one,
like that's
2
the right
movies,
move,
but yeah. So I guess Harry Potter, I always thought was interesting. And I will say that I think that the public behavior of Harry Potter's author in recent years has called some of this into question. Because I always thought that Harry Potter was like a really smart synthesis of kind of like all the lessons of Western civilization, right? So it's like a bunch of Messiah narratives all bundled into each other, plus all the history that we learned through like World War II and the civil rights movement and all this stuff kind of like condensed and fictionalized and repackaged. I always took issue with the fact that people thought Harry Potter was like this great moral teaching, because I was like, these are all borrowed, you know, this is like, it's like a Quentin Tarantino movie, you know, where like it's just kind of like a mashup of his favorite things.
Like stuff. Yeah.
Now, a really funny thing that's happened in the last couple of years is that I would say my sense of the authorship of both J.K. Rowling and Quentin Tarantino have kind of flipped, because it's become clear that Quentin Tarantino isn't just synthesizing movie history. He's kind of expressing his own regret about the world in the only way that he knows how, which is like revisiting the past and revisiting cinema history. And it really sounds like the last movie he's working on, The Film Critic, is going to be like a massive summarization of all of that, right? He's going to apparently like be recreating movies that he grew up loving. And I don't know how that's all going to coalesce, but I'm really excited to kind of hear that grand statement, because I didn't really think Quentin Tarantino was heading for a grand statement. And all of a sudden he is, right? And meanwhile, J.K. Rowling, you know, without getting into it, I would say I feel like J.K. Rowling has missed some of her own lessons in the Harry Potter story. And the fact that she missed them made me think that they're arrived at far more accidentally than I ever would have believed, right? She kind of lucked into it. And I wish
maybe it was the hand on the hand.
Right. Yeah. I wish I didn't feel that way about it. I wish that experience hadn't colored Harry Potter. But I do think, like, if you think about what are the main points of a Messiah narrative, you know, and part of it is definitely like being chosen, having these sort of prophecies that surround you that you feel ambiguous about, sort of dying or having your back broken or something, going into some kind of magical train station or cave or hole, coming back out, right? It follows all the beats in a way that makes you aware of the beats. And I think as like a person who is interested in storytelling, I love that about stories like Harry Potter that will make you aware of it, right? Like there are kids who understand the tropes of like the Messiah narrative, or like like Joseph Campbell, like hero's journey, or even like just the Odyssey kind of thing, like that idea of it. They can start to understand those story beats through something like Harry Potter. It's like very legible. And so I always appreciate that kind of work, because it teaches people to be writers, teaches you to be a storyteller. That's how you learn.
There's the men's retreats that I do. We have and we're time to make the last turn,
for you,
and it'll be
like Harry Potter and men's retreats.
It's good. We showed this clip from TED Ed, and it's basically like a 3.5-minute summary of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And they use Harry Potter as one of the most accessible examples of the hero's journey.
For sure.
They also use Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, and I haven't got into that yet, but I know I've got a Hunger Games sort of chapter. Other than that, I think I talked to you about this last time, the Ballad of Snakes and Songbirds. That's the only part of the Hunger Games world that I've experienced. But because it was with my kids, that's what made it meaningful for me.
Yeah.
Not its connection to sort of the broader story and understanding where this character goes next. So I want to do something possibly risky, but in the spirit of like doing something real, which is this J.K. Rowling like thing. Like she has basically taken her legacy and tarnished it or destroyed it in the eyes of many. And so I have a weird... and I'm gonna land this plane, or at least take it out of the tailspin that it looks like I might be going into.
I'm on board.
So there's a really interesting podcast called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. Are you aware of it, or have you listened to it?
I've heard about it, but I haven't listened to it.
So it's one of the members, or former members of the Westboro Baptist Church, who has since sort of renounced her affiliation with that church, and I believe her affiliation and her belief in God and Jesus and Christianity sort of all together. But then she sort of goes into transgender decade, let's say, that we've sort of been in, and then specifically how J.K. Rowling's stance around transgender issues has changed people's appreciation of her film. So it's interesting. I won't say anything else than that, but it's interesting. And she interviews J.K. Rowling in some depth, and interviews a lot of people. Contrapoints is a part of that. Do you know Contrapoints, the YouTuber?
No.
She's a transgender YouTuber, and absolutely she's up there with Tom van der Linden. Like Cannot recommend her more highly. Has amazing content. Check that out.
All right, it's on my list.
So my final savior is Neo from the Matrix.
Oh yeah.
So for me, wait, I guess I do. I may have one more, but we're gonna stick with this because of the way that the conversation is flowing. So you've got your first movie, which, a lot of people jumped in and said, oh yeah, there's the Jesus Mo. Oh, he's dying. He's come back to life. And I'm like, they could have sort of left it there. Do you have an experience or a memory of when you saw the first Matrix film? What did it impact you like it impacted my generation?
I really liked the first Matrix. And then I thought the second and third were like, wow, these are really wild. Like whatever this is like really wild. And I feel like my takeaway from especially 2 and 3 was like, big swing. And that was kind of where it ended.
I don't like how you feel about James Cameron and some of his, big swings that he takes.
Yeah, like I appreciate a big swing. And beyond that, I don't have a lot of feeling about it. But I do, I mean, I remember really enjoying The Matrix and being pretty fascinated by the way that a lot of the technological innovations of that movie just sort of immediately became a part of everyone's visual lexicon forever.
Yeah. No, it's a movie that made a cultural impact. And like, there's a part of me that believes because it made that cultural impact, like, Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, all those things, Harry Potter, it's like, that is almost, in Joseph Campbell's way, like that is evidence of it is maybe archetypal. Like we're tapping into something that humanity or certain societies would resonate with and connect to. Whether that starts and ends with Jesus, we can debate that, at another time. But whatever that savior archetype, it seems to hit there as well. And then around the same time that Dune 1 was coming out in this, pandemic inflicted, year of 2021, I think, when they said, hey, we're going to release all our movies at home instead of in the theater, even though we shot them that way. So I saw Dune 1 at home with my son. Then I saw Matrix Resurrections at home with my son. And the first time I saw it, I had 20 years of expectations projected and built into it, of which it then let me down and disappointed me. And it went in so many directions that I did not expect it to.
Yeah.
But then on the subsequent viewing, knowing where it was going to go, I could see and appreciate all those beats for what they were. And the sort of twist and the recognition, I've got this weird feature with my computer to where it does these balloons sometimes. I can't remember what the hand gestures are, but apparently that was one of them.
Wow.
The twist of the fact that Neo is not actually the savior on his own, but it's actually like this dyad of him and Trinity, like blew my mind and resonated so deeply for me. Like when I think of those flaws, as I'll call them, that's too wrong, that's too strong. The character of Jesus in the Bible, again, in fact, he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have kids, like he's missing those sort of like key relational components that Neo as the savior then gets that. And then it's like the fact that the Wachowski brothers are now the Wachowski sisters and their whole sort of gender journey, the whole thing just landed with me so deeply of, if you have a savior complex, check out your relationship with your spouse. How are you sacrificing to your partner, like today? Like just bring it home, like very, very concrete ways of, this is probably a more helpful way of being a savior instead of trying to save the whole world.
Yeah.
How can you sacrifice for your partner today? And then it goes to, okay, my kids, my father, my mother, my parents, like those sort of up and down things. But anyway, so that was the thing for me, to where if there was ever like a savior figure that eclipsed Jesus for me, it's the Neo Trinity sort of dyad in the Matrix Resurrections.
I think it's cool that I never saw the Matrix Resurrections, but I do think it's cool when creators.
Damn, I spoiled it again.
That's cool. I think it's cool when creators revisit things because they have something smaller to say, and that's cool. Like we have this cultural expectation that everything has to be like bigger. And it's cool when something comes along that's sort of like intentionally a smaller, finer point. You know, like I've made my big grand statements, and now I'm trying to say something a little bit smaller. I feel like that sometimes as a creative person. I feel like sometimes you make these big, grand, weird things, right? I remember like 10 years ago, I'm not saying I was the first person to do this, but I was like a vlogger, you know, and I did a 23-minute vlog, which at the time was not normal. Now they're like 4 hours long because it's about now we're the attention economy. At the time, that wasn't the case, right? At the time, YouTube wouldn't even count it as a view unless you watched it all the way through. It wasn't about minutes. It was about completion. So everything was short. I did this very long thing, right? And it was like this, just there was lots and lots of music and montages and things. It was kind of where I set the template for even what the podcast would be. And over the years, I've had like big grand statement episodes of the podcast and everything too. But there are times when you're like, there's a lot more wisdom in just kind of like finding one little tiny point to make. Not kind of a big grand thing about how to live or what the world is or what's important, but just like something about the way you live out your day, you know, or something about the way you have a conversation. So anyway, there is this cycle that artists go through, and I forget what it's actually called, but you know, if you look at the career of someone like Bob Dylan, you know, they have this point where they kind of like return to like look at the old masters. You know, Bob Dylan released like a triple disc album of Frank Sinatra covers, you know, and it was like he'd reached the point in his career where he'd done all this creativity, and then he was like, who came before me and what can I learn from? You know, and maybe I'm a little late to be doing that, but why don't I try? And I don't know. There's something I guess I like about that. I like a tiny little point of wisdom. I like a little period on the exclamation point.
I think this is perfect and poetic, and I may have miscounted my saviors, but my final savior, I think, embodies this very well. Ted Lasso. So Ted Lasso as a Christ figure. And remind me, what's your exposure to Ted Lasso at this point?
I watched the first 2 seasons. I really liked both of them. I was kind of just getting mired in the 3rd season. So I was like, I will come back to this later. But I do have a pretty strong sense of where it went. Like I'm plugged in to the internet enough that I kind of know.
I figured you couldn't avoid it. Yeah. Well, and the way that I sort of took, you know, the very ending was that sort of like, okay, it's these sort of big things, and things are getting sort of bigger and bigger, and more people are being impacted, and it's almost like a movement, and there's a book being written about it, and then it's like very end, it's kind of about a dad coaching like his son's, you know, soccer team.
Right.
Like showing up on a Saturday morning and like being the dad to a crowd of none, or maybe one when that kid remembers it, you know, 15 years, you know, from now, when the Cat's in the Cradle is playing in the background.
Yeah, it was clear, by the way, from episode 1 of season 3 that's where I was going.
Yeah, and though it's, for me, that the level of what made me care about Ted and his sacrifice was less about the soccer, even though I am a soccer guy, and just sort of more about the relationship that he had with his son, his soon-to-be ex-wife, you know, what happens, you know, in the first season. And then in the 2nd season, we find out that his father committed suicide, and just sort of how he struggles to deal with his own depression and the things that would seem to point to that potentially being a path that he would have to go down. I loved it. There was just so much to appreciate about how he sort of laid everything down at the end. And his sacrifice wasn't, I'm going to be killed for all of humanity, but I'm going to lay down this lucrative coaching thing that I built because this time with my son is precious. And that's that's my number one thing, and I'm gonna live through that value every day.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that's a great, Ted Lasso is definitely going to go down in history as one of the great dad shows. Even before it got there, but just for its incredibly corny sense of humor, like us dads, we know we can appreciate that. So yeah, it would not have occurred to me that Ted Lasso was kind of a messianic figure, but yeah, I mean, believe, right? We got the big sign.
Exactly.
Right? It's right.
Exactly.
It's right over my boss's office over here. So
he's spouting off these little parables and little words of wisdom, little aphorisms throughout the show, and that's kind of what you read about Jesus doing in the Gospels, and he's calling people to be better versions of themselves, and they all have their own sort of like mini transformations after sort of being pulled into and being exposed to his way of being.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's at least my argument. Maybe a little bit of a palate cleanser, based on where we could have landed the plane. But what are some like final thoughts that you might have, things that came up for this exercise, or just even experience discussing it, together?
I think we found the big ones. I think that I do when I'm looking for like a Messiah story. I think I am looking for a lot of those Joseph Campbell kind of like touch points along the way. And I some of your choices have made me think like, oh, you don't necessarily need that, right? Like there's other ways in which a person can be a Messiah. So I'll be kind of on the lookout for that as I think back through things that I like and watch. My half suggestion, my half Messiah was going to be Jeevan from Station 11.
That's so good. That's so good. The great healer.
I think that Station 11 plays around a lot with the idea of a Messiah, right? You have you almost like you take the characteristics of it and you split it among three characters, because you have, you have Jeevan, who has a kind of like meta Messiah arc where he disappears from the story and returns. And then you have the prophet, who's kind of like the evil mirror version. And then you have someone like Kirsten, who has like these obvious leadership abilities that she's like resisting. She has the ability to kind of like lead, but she's holding back for some reason. And so the way those stories all spin out and everything is very different than you would anticipate. And I still, that's the show that I still hold everything else up to. Did anything,
what's your number one?
Did anything get me the way that Station 11 did? And the answer is still no. And I know that history will vindicate me someday. People will be like, there was a TV show that had Mackenzie Davis and Himesh Patel and Daniel Deadweiler on it all at the same time, and it wasn't the most successful television show ever made. And
I literally just recommended to somebody that this past weekend. I feel like I'm constantly evangelizing and Johnny Appleseeding Station 11.
Every 10 people that you tell to watch the show, one of them might, and those people
will get there.
Will be converted.
We'll get there.
So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, great choice. That was, and I'll tell you what sort of flipped for me, because I came up with 3 and then you came up with 5.5. And I was like, crap, I gotta get 2 more and quick. And so I actually Googled like Hollywood saviors, which is just stupid. And I got
Tom Cruise.
I didn't get any good results. Okay. So AI taking over for us is a little farther away from me after that search. And then I kind of like sort of reverse engineered it, and I was like, okay, let's say I've seen myself tend to respond to the savior motif, the savior archetype. What are other things that I just love that are in my pantheon somewhere? Maybe there's a savior motif in there that I hadn't seen and wouldn't have called it that. And so then I went to the Ted Lasso, and I went to the to Lost and all. It's like, okay, yeah, these are the things that I actually love. And oh wait, yeah, I do see the savior motif kind of showing up there as well. So again, I don't know if we figured out if Jesus really existed, but
let's plan on doing a sequel to this when Mission Impossible 8 comes out, because they are in Dead Reckoning, which is like the first half of it. They are planting a lot of kind of Christ imagery in the movie.
Okay.
So it does feel like that's where we're headed. And I could talk about Tom Cruise for like 2 hours, no problem.
I would welcome that, and also say if that comes first, or the sequel to The Passion of the Christ, Whichever one of those comes first.
Electric Boogaloo.
What's that?
Passion 2, Electric Boogaloo. This time it's personal.
I'm sure you've got 5 more in the chamber.
The Way of Water.
Oh, okay. Now we've got our title. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Zach, I'm gonna let you go, and I appreciate the conversation. And for people who don't know, they don't have the time for a podcast, they should make the time to listen to yours. And if they don't have the time, they should just follow you on Twitter because you've got great content coming all the time. So if this was in any way interesting or entertaining, trust me, this is what Zach is like all the time on Twitter, on his podcast.
I can't turn it off.
You guys will love it. Yeah, he can't turn it off. All right, we'll talk to you later.
Good to talk to you.
Yep.
See ya.
What are they shouting?
Listen, Al-Qaid. Voice from the outer world. It's their name for Messiah.